ShopGearNetwork.com.
The following is a presentation of the Gear Radio Network.
Ladies and gentlemen, this podcast is sponsored by our store through Amazon. If you visit ShopGear.com, please remember to do that, because when you do, you provide gasoline to the engine known as Gear Radio Network, and that helps this podcast continue. It is the best way to shop for yourself, and is the best way to support this podcast. Now, on with the show.
As we are joined by a very knowledgeable man in the professional wrestling world, Mr. Mike Quackenbush. How are you tonight, Mike?
Oh, I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me on, Pat.
Well, this interview basically came about because our show got tagged in a tweet about your upcoming book that's been released on Amazon along other sites. It being called 7 Keys to Becoming a Better Performer, a book for fellow professional wrestlers. Now, your career has been gone over the last decade. Was your career one of the reasons that it led to you writing this book?
Yeah, in a couple different ways. When I first started out in independent wrestling, I was doing some of my first pro matches in 1994. And some of the places I went initially, like the Pittsburgh area, rural West Virginia, eastern Ohio, I was able to get booked in these places, and I had no professional training at all. The downside to that was I had some very serious injuries. What we do in the ring, it's difficult, it's challenging. It can be, of course, it's physically challenging, and I don't think many people doubt that. Even people that don't understand, the artifice of professional wrestling entirely realize that, of course, it's always physically dangerous. Like that oft-repeated bit from the beginning of every WWE DVD anyone's ever had. Like, how do you learn to fall off a 20-foot ladder? Or, obviously, people understand there are physical risks making live combat theater. But there's all kinds of other challenges, too, to being a good performer, how we engage our audience. And a lot of times in training, we spend so much time talking about the physical mechanics of what we do. This is how a suplex works, and this is what you do for a powerbomb, etc. But we don't talk enough about the aspects that make up the performance side of what we do. And so all of that kind of led me to writing 7 Keys to Becoming a Better Performer.
Well, absolutely. Well, one of the things with pro wrestling is, yes, everybody sees the athletic side of professional wrestling, where guys getting thrown off ropes and hitting the mat, but they also see the performance side because over the last decade, 15, even 20 years, the professional wrestling echelon, being the WWE, has gone from a professional wrestling aspect to a more entertainment aspect. Now, with that being said, and you're bringing up performance, with you writing this book, these keys are to help you become a better performer, but are they also helping you become a better wrestler?
Well, I think it's one and the same. Being a professional wrestler now means being a great performance artist. You have to be an engaging performer. It's not enough to just be well versed in technical wrestling holds. There was an era where you might be able to get by on something like that. I mean, think back to, if you watch old black and white footage, you can even find some of this stuff on YouTube. I was watching a match that had the Mighty Atlas in it from 1953 that happens to be on YouTube. There was a time where you could get by on having a unique physique and knowing a couple wrestling holds. But in an era where people fully understand what professional wrestling is, they know that what they're seeing is live combat theater, not genuine competition. The demand is so much higher as an entertainer, as a performer, and as attention spans continue to shrink, you've got to fight harder to keep people's attention. So what makes for engaging entertainment? And we have to look outside of just the world of professional wrestling for ideas, and a lot of that's referenced in my book. There's a whole chapter in here about vulnerability, for example.
Okay.
And one of the main things that I'm drawing on there are some recent superhero films. What can we learn from these characters about how we bring vulnerability to the stage? What is it that engages people? What makes them go on an emotional journey? As much as being a professional wrestler is about being a good performance artist, you must also be a very capable storyteller. It's the stories that keep people coming back time and time again. There will always be somebody that has a cooler move. There was a time when there was nothing cooler than the Canadian Destroyer, for example.
Oh, absolutely.
But that was for about a month.
Yeah.
And then someone did the Canadian Destroyer off the top rope. Then there's the guy in Japan who does it like a tombstone pile driver. So, that has a very limited shelf life. But characters that engage people and very emotional storytelling never goes out of fashion.
Now, you bring up vulnerability. You saying that you focus on a whole chapter about that. Do you see the up-and-coming generation now of professional wrestlers showing off that vulnerability in their performance, in their moves, in the way they approach the audience?
Well, I think in my experience, and I get to travel around a lot. For example, I teach seminars. I get to go all over the planet. Like a little over a month ago, I got to spend a week in Australia teaching people about professional wrestling. I'm very fortunate in that I get to meet a lot of young up-and-comers. And there are aspects of performing that just aren't being talked about enough currently. And that's something that comes up time and time again. When I'm on the road, if I have the opportunity to throw it out to people and say, hey, like, what's something that you feel like we could spend some time focusing on? The way in which we emote and the way in which we get the audience to go on the emotional journey with our characters comes up time and time again. And don't get me wrong, there's a very good reason why my nickname in wrestling was the Master of 1,000 Holds. If you want to do wacky submission holds, goofy arm drags, and every other kind of crazy transition you can think of, I love doing that. But sometimes it is not so much the mechanical parts that are being neglected so much as the performance parts are. And yeah, I think there's a whole generation of people coming up that want to drill into that aspect of the work even more.
Is there any one aspects of the book that you were holding close to the vest or you really appreciative of writing and bringing the information to all generations of pro wrestling, especially the up-and-coming generation now?
Well, it's definitely very relevant to the current generation. I think the kinds of challenges that faced the wrestlers of the 1950s, the Pat O'Connors and the Mighty Atlases, are very different from the challenges that our forebears in the 80s had to deal with. What Roddy Piper and Ted DiBiase had to overcome is totally different than what we're dealing with in an age where everyone's character is represented on social media. We have videography as clear as 4K now. The challenges that we're faced as modern performers are totally different. And that's not to say there aren't lessons to be learned from the people that came before us and blazed a trail for us. But I think a lot of the training centers where I go to, they're teaching stuff that's from 20, 30 years ago. And that's not necessarily relevant to the challenges today's pro wrestlers are facing.
Through all your traveling and everything and the people you've come to meet and so on, what are some of the challenges that the current generation are facing today in pro wrestling?
Well, that's a fantastic question. And, the more I get out there and the more that I get to travel around, the more this sort of thing comes up. Here's a simple example I can give you. One of the things I'm asked about constantly is there a way to structure the kinds of promotional messages, the kinds of promos that we cut to compel viewership? Because a challenge we're all up against is these shrinking attention spans, like I alluded to. Like, you may know some of these statistics. For example, if you started watching a YouTube video, like on the sidebar where YouTube recommends all these other videos to you, do you know on average now how long it takes before someone decides, will I watch what's in front of me or will I jump to the next video? Do you happen to know this statistic?
I do not.
It's 7.5 seconds.
Oh, wow.
Within 7.5 seconds, someone will decide, are they going to finish watching this promotional message that you've recorded, or are they going to jump to the next thing? So, and if that's what you have to compel somebody to buy a ticket to see you wrestle, or to watch a live stream where you're going to be performing, or just to keep their attention, what can you do? Like, what are the ingredients of making these compelling promotional messages? So we have to break that down. We have to take a look at each exact ingredient. Like, how do we make people anticipate a match that hasn't happened yet? What compels them to want to see the outcome when wrestling is more easily obtained than ever before? Like, almost all of us have the WWE Network on a mobile device that's probably in our pocket right now. And that's bigger than when I used to collect VHS tapes. I used to have a wall of VHS wrestling tapes. There's more wrestling in my pocket on the WWE Network right now than a 15-year-long collection of VHS tapes. So I'm competing against that. I'm competing against all the free content that's on YouTube. Maybe you own, like, if you have New Japan World, or you watch one of the other proprietary streaming apps like Chikaratopia, it'd be easy for you to just jump in and watch something else. So the landscape is more crowded than ever. And there's more people competing. Like, they want you to watch their match. Mm-hmm. So everyone's always asking, like, what gives me a leg up? And the truth is, as the years have gone on here, I'm about to, not too long from now, I start into my 25th year in professional wrestling. The idea of constantly traveling and getting out there and teaching, the reality is I turn down more of these types of engagements than I actually accept anymore. Mm-hmm. But 7 Keys to Becoming a Better Performer is an easy way for me to get my message out there. I don't need to come to your training facility for you to check this out. Or I also make a podcast for pro wrestlers called Kayfabe 2.0 that's, in terms of its tone and content, very similar to the book. Mm-hmm. So this helps me to reach a much larger audience because, every once and again I'm going to get an offer to go to a town in Texas that I've never heard of, and I'm probably just not going to go.
It easily could be like one of the towns that are like an hour away from Dallas, but they're really small. They have a select group, but it's not a draw like, say, going to like Houston and working for one of the promotions there.
Right, and I'm always very flattered that people are interested to have me come and teach at their facility. Don't get me wrong.
Absolutely.
But I can't be everywhere and do everything. Not to say that it isn't very flattering, but this book and my podcast are an easy way for me to reach groups that I know, I'm just not, what's that? It's going to take me how many hours to fly to wherever you are to teach for 2, 4, or 6 hours? Mm-hmm. I think there must be a more efficient way of doing it. And that's kind of, in part, what motivated me to tackle the book at the same time that I'm putting the podcast out. They kind of work hand in hand.
Okay. So for the wrestlers that are out there that you may not be able to get to, you have the podcast, you now have the book, you have various other ways for them to get the information and see the information, for them to use it and apply it to their own craft.
Exactly. And in this day and age, you've got to make it as easy as possible, which is why on Amazon.com, if you want the book delivered digitally to your mobile device, you have it in seconds. That's the way it needs to be done. People want that instant access to the information. And I'm glad that I have the opportunity. I have these vehicles at my disposal to deliver it.
Absolutely. Now, you're coming up on your 25th year in pro wrestling. In the 20-plus years you've been involved, how has things changed or progressed from when you started to now? And when you say the book that you've written pertains to the current generation, those things that you've talked about in your book apply throughout. Because there could be some people that have been in the business for 10 years and they may know something or think of a certain way, but then they read your book and go, hey, this makes a lot of sense. Let me try to apply this, even though I've been working for 10 plus years.
Mm-hmm. And if that is the case, that's great. It's always very rewarding when, you can sit down with somebody or they can read your book or listen to your podcast and take some value away and say, this helps evolve my game. Everybody's looking for the opportunity to become a more well-rounded performer. Chances are, you look around the independents where there's tens of thousands of performers, and this guy wants to go to the WWE, and, this guy dreams of wrestling for New Japan. This guy wants to go to AAA. This guy's looking to audition for Ring of Honor. Whatever that thing they're aspiring to, they're looking for an opportunity to improve. And what I can say about the current generation, which is very heartening to me, mm-hmm. and it's in strong contrast to the group of people that I came up with when I first started breaking into the independents in 94 and 95, mm-hmm. is that back then there was an unbelievable close-mindedness in wrestling. For example, if I was lucky enough that I got to I'd wrestle a Mexican luchador, for example, and I would learn some lucha libre, no doubt I would go somewhere and somebody would tell me, that Mexican style of wrestling is all wrong. We don't do that here. Like, if you want to do that, you move to Mexico, but we make wrestling one way here in the United States, and what you're doing is wrong. Or, we only do things in this one rigid way, and everything you've learned from other teachers, it's wrong, because here we only do it like this. And there was a really close-mindedness to, anything that even remotely seemed like an out-of-the-box idea. I think today, wrestling is more global in an era of the internet. 1994, the internet in general is in its nascent stage. But now, through the ubiquity of the internet, Right? My same phone that has the WWE Network on it has New Japan World. It's easy for me to watch wrestling from the complete opposite side of the planet. We have a better, more global understanding of professional wrestling than at any past point. And I think it's kind of bred a more accepting culture in wrestling, not just when it comes to in-ring style, but, it was a huge deal when Vince McMahon, as the industry leader, decided to distinguish himself as sports entertainment. And to start to kind of open up and understand, to continue down a certain path as it relates to this is sort of taking or regarding our audience with a degree of contempt. And we need to be a little more on the level with our audience. It's important that they understand exactly what we are and what we are not. And that doesn't mean that they don't enjoy us. That doesn't mean that people aren't willing to suspend their disbelief and still watch wrestling, buy tickets to see it live, et cetera, et cetera. But, that regime change also kind of all happened since I started out as well. And now we're in a place where, I know guys are constantly looking outside the box in more and more experimental areas for where's the next idea that might inspire us as performers, as wrestlers. And I'm really grateful that attitude change has happened, because it felt very oppressive when, if you came back with an idea, you were fortunate enough to travel somewhere else, even if you just went into another area, like when the Midwest independents seemed very different from the East Coast independents. If you came back with something, I did a weekend in Michigan. Well, what those Michigan guys do is all wrong. That's not how we do it here in Ohio. As asinine as that sounds, there was a time when that pervaded all of independent wrestling, and it was a really closed-minded, ignorant view.
The change of mind over the past, 20 years has, from just like you talked to, that closed mindedness to now where everything's open. Everybody has access to everything. Now, outside of the book, The 7 Ways to Become a Better Performer, what kind of advice would you give the current generation to improve themselves in the ring, in their performance, in the way they carry themselves on social media? Because I'm sure the book has all of this. You have to be a ton of knowledge being over 20 years in the business. What would you say to guys that are just coming up into the business that are, say, maybe in their second year or less?
I would share a lesson that I learned very early on in my wrestling career, which is this. Always seek out people who know more than you do. And you might train somewhere for a while and you feel like, I've learned this particular curriculum, but where else could I go to be challenged again? Where could I go and someone's going to teach me something different? Maybe I'm going to learn a different storytelling structure. Maybe I'm going to learn a different set of holds. Or this guy was trained in South America in the 1970s. So how does what this guy knows differ from what I was taught in Brooklyn, New York? Always seek out someone who knows more than you do. And I know there are people out there that makes them feel a certain kind of way. They feel less than expert when they have to admit, I don't know everything. But to open yourself up to constantly learning, you're just going to develop so much more rapidly. You will become a so better-rounded performer when you constantly realize somewhere out there, there's always someone that knows more about the craft than you do. Well, hunt them down relentlessly, and sit under their learning tree.
The book that you wrote, The 7 Ways to Become a Better Performer, does that just apply to guys that are working in the ring, or can that be applied to someone that's aspiring to be a manager or a ring announcer because they've tried the pro wrestling, they tried the training, and decided it wasn't for them, but they still want to be involved in the business, but they're going a different route?
Well, my tendency is to think that yes, it would, for this reason. The feedback that I've gotten on social media about the book has surprised me in this way. People said, I'm not a professional wrestler at all, but I took a lot of value away from the book. This book makes me better at my job. It makes me better at this other thing that I do, or this other thing that I'm passionate about. So even though in my mind I wrote this from my perspective as both a professional wrestler and a trainer of pro wrestlers, and I meant this for fellow pro wrestlers, I have heard from a lot of people not involved in wrestling whatsoever that they still took some value away from it. So I'm really encouraged to think that maybe it has a broader audience than I had realized. Absolutely,
and that's the thing with pro wrestling. Pro wrestling always has a broad audience, because you may have someone that likes tag team wrestling or the women's wrestling or some kind of other aspect. So the fact that your book and the feedback you've gotten is showing that you have a broader audience just means you're going to get more people involved and see this book to make them a better performer in whatever they may do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I certainly hope so.
Well, we'd like to thank you for coming on because we're getting near the end, but this is your time to promote yourself, YouTube, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, all your websites for your the book, every place they can get it, every place they can find you, like message you for booking information or anything like that.
Sure. Yeah, my new book, 7 Keys to Becoming a Better Performer, a book for fellow pro wrestlers, is available right now worldwide via Amazon.com. You can get the digital copy sent to your mobile device, or Amazon will even print you one copy and mail it right to you. You'll have it probably in a day or two if you got Amazon Prime. And I am out and about teaching seminars all the time, and I'm looking to book more in 2018. The easiest way to reach me is on Twitter, where I'm at Mike Quackenbush, and I'm tweeting about my podcast, Kayfabe 2.0, my work at home at Chikara, or where I'm the head trainer at the Wrestle Factory in the northeast corner of Philadelphia. Twitter is certainly the easiest way to reach me, and this just recently came up, so I'm going to take a moment to point it out. I'm not on Facebook, and a few people had said to me, I tried messaging you on Facebook, but that's not me. So, please use at Mike Quackenbush if you're looking for me on social media. I would look forward to hearing from you.
But once again, thank you for the interview. We'll definitely get you back on again down the road where I'll be joined by my co-host where we'll talk even more stuff. But is there anything else you'd like to say before we let you go?
No, thanks again, Pat, for giving me a forum to talk a little bit about my new project. I really appreciate it.
The preceding presentation has been brought to you by the Gear Network.